are an academic institution, and our primary mission is to educate and theologically empower women and to serve society at large. Most of our students are postgraduates following master's and doctoral programs of Cambridge University and Anglia Ruskin University. These programs are open to both women and men. We run enrichment courses. We only just finished a very interesting course on Thomas Merton last night. We organize study days and public lectures. We take part in research projects and other collaborative initiatives. Our theology, while Roman Catholic, is grounded in wisdom tradition in which philosophy plays an important part. Our theology is done in the ecumenical and interreligious spirit of the Cambridge Theological Federation, of which we are a member. We describe our work as dialogical. Our theology is always in dialogue with other disciplines and increasingly professional practices. Many people who have come to value what our institute offers comment on the transformative experience of our approach to education and the very personal discovery or rediscovery of what makes them flourish as human beings. This year, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary. So we are incredibly honored in this Jubilee year to have Professor Sir Roger Scruton deliver this special public lecture on the topic of human nature. Sir Roger, thank you for accepting our invitation. I also would like to thank the Master and Fellows of Emmanuel College for their hospitality in enabling this lecture and reception to be held in the college. I am grateful to my amazing colleagues for their creativity and commitment in organizing this event, especially to Dr. Ferdia Stone-Davis and Mrs. Thea Raymer, and to our students for their help and support. After Sir Roger's lecture, there will be time for questions. We will end this part of the evening around 6:30, maybe a few minutes earlier, and you will be invited to the Old Library for the drink reception. During the reception, there will be an opportunity to purchase some books by Sir Roger and even have them signed. You will also have a chance to find out more about our institute and our forthcoming events and courses. There will be a board with information in the Old Library, and my colleagues and I will be there to answer your question. So may I wish you all a very enjoyable evening. And now I invite my colleague, Dr. Ferdia Stone-Davis, to introduce our speaker. Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Sir Roger Scruton. Roger has written over 40 books covering a wide range of areas, including philosophy, aesthetics of music, architecture, as well as novels. He is an internationally acclaimed writer, as well as a unique public figure whose intellectual acuity is met in same measure with the courage to seek the truth of the matter, rather than what is fashionable. Despite this, Roger reassures me he is not as frightening as he seems. Today, we welcome Roger to talk to us about human nature.
I've written on a wide variety of topics and always tried to relate my philosophical thinking to perceptions of how the world actually is. And architecture has been one of my obsessions over the years. I wrote a book on the aesthetics of architecture, which appeared first in 1979 and is still in print because it's one of the few books which actually addresses this most important issue from overt philosophical premises. You will have noticed that this room is extremely inconvenient for all of you. You have to make a decision when you enter as to whether you're going to advance to the middle of the row or try and fight it out at the end and prevent others from going past you. If there were a fire, you would find it extremely difficult to get out of the row where you've been imprisoned. And the fact of the matter is that it's no particular advantage to be stacked up in that way. Had it been an ordinary hall, a flat floor with a lot of chairs in it, and I raised on a podium in front of you, you all would have seen me just as well, and you could have arranged yourselves absolutely at your ease in the place where you wish to observe me from. That, however, would have been accomplished without an architect. So this room is a perfectly good illustration of what it is that architects do and how they have managed to make themselves indispensable at great cost to the rest of us. Most of Cambridge, you'll be pleased to know, was not built by architects at all. My old College of Jesus does have the work of an architect in one corner, or two architects, but one in particular, Waterhouse, the great pre-Raphaelite painter and Gothic builder, where I spent my first days in Cambridge. But the main part of Jesus College, nobody knows who built it at all, which is why it is infinitely adaptable and will always be useful. This place, of course, will have to change. Now, so back to the real topic of my lecture, which is human nature. The question of what kind of thing we are is first and foremost a philosophical question, since it concerns the concepts under which we are assembled when we utter that crucial word we. Who are we? What kind of thing are we? We know ourselves as members of a kind, and the first person plural, the we, is not just a description of that kind, but a kind of commitment to it. We recognize that we commit ourselves to our nature in some way. And the same goes for terms like humanity, human being. We criticize each other for our inhumanity. We recognize that being humane or being a human being, this is a kind of expression of approval, and we attempt to earn those labels. So surreptitiously, these terms like humanity and human being recruit us to the cause of our being, to the examples whereby we live, and the endeavor that is distinctive of our species to live in another way. And that there I've referred to our species. In other words, I've used a scientific category. Nobody writing or talking about human nature in the 19th century, or very few people, would have used the expression our species to summarize what we are. But nowadays it is perfectly normal and acceptable to refer to ourselves, to humanity in that way, using a scientific category that takes its sense from observation, and which makes no distinction of a radical kind between our way of being and the being of other animals. And by saying that, I have also implied that we are animals, and therefore that our nature, whatever it is the nature of a specific kind of animal. In which case, what has philosophy got to do with it? Should we not renounce the philosophical question of human nature and simply defer to scientific method, taking instances of the kind to which we belong and subjecting them to the usual methods of scientific investigation? Maybe it's the anatomist, the biologist, the neuroscientist, and so on, who are going to be the real authorities as to what we are, rather than those philosophical and theological theories which have previously dominated the intellectual landscape. But this kind of question, the question of what we are, is, even in the mouths of a scientist, already pregnant with philosophy. It already concedes that there is a kind of philosophical decision involved in surrendering the question of our nature to science, whether it's the science of biology or neuroscience or whatever. It means discounting those aspects of our being which have no place in the scientific inventory, because they're not aspects of the organism at all, but part of the extraordinary halo that we carry through life, and which is observable to others who wear it, but to no other animal in the ordinary empirical world, the halo which I shall be describing of personality. One aspect of this is freedom. The concept of freedom takes us back a little, and I want you all to reimagine the condition of Europe as it was in the immediate post-war period, when people, especially on the continent, bore in themselves the memory of human beings in all their vulnerability, forced to make radical choices, maybe sometimes even to surrender members of their own family to the powers that be, to see people herded into camps where they were done to death. They were made familiar with the absolute divide between living and dying, since so many of them lived on that edge. But Sartre influenced me not because of what he said, but because of the kind of figure that he was in French culture. He was somebody who was totally part of the whole debate about the identity of France, its condition in the post-war period, what it had been through and what it would become. And also he expressed this not just in abstract philosophical works, but in lively novels and plays, which established his reputation as a genuine literary figure, part of the pantheon of French literature, to which I had a great inclination myself. Not that I could ever belong to it, of course. Now, that model that he set for me was the model of the philosopher-writer for whom writing and philosophy were indistinguishable, seamlessly joined. And he tried to express the connection between them by showing in literary ways why freedom, which is ultimately a philosophical concept, was a concept also that we live by, and that the French during the Second World War had been forced to live by this concept in a way which caused many people to make the wrong choices from which they could not recover, choices of collaboration and so on. His thought was that actually freedom is not just an arbitrary addition to our existence as animals. It's not that we are apes plus freedom. The freedom that I enjoy actually is what is most fundamental to my nature. That's what I fundamentally am, a free being, because I am what I choose to be. And this is what existence as a human being consists in. I always have that capacity to make the choice, even in the most ultimate and terrifying circumstances. That capacity to choose my own nature is implanted in me as my way of being. And this is because my nature derives ultimately from what I am as I, from what he called le pour soi, the for itself. That my conception of what I am for myself is my conception of what I ultimately am, and that is rooted in freedom. And I alone can know and be that thing. And he drew the conclusion that therefore there's no essence that precedes my existence. Nobody can say what I am essentially and objectively from a point of view outside my own decision. My own decision, my own exercise of choice is the thing that determines me as the thing that I am. So what I am does not constrain me. It is me. It is the object of my choice. And he'd summarize this by saying that in our case, the case of humanity, existence precedes essence. The fact of existence is the ultimate fact, and that fact is bound up with the choices that I make. And this is, of course, this is true of everything that exists as I exist, everything that can say I. And you're a part of that too. You can say I, and you relate to me as one being that says I can relate to another being that says I, that knows itself in the first person. Animals are not in that condition, but we are. And therefore the belief in an objective human nature, Sartre thought, is a kind of surrender to others, a renunciation of what I fundamentally am, a renunciation of that freedom which tells me to choose my own being for myself. And this seemed to him like the only way to hold on to the uniquely human condition in a dehumanized world. It was the answer that he found to the great betrayal, the betrayal of his country by his country in the Second World War. Now that is a very radical position, but it has it reverberates in many people because he seems to release us from the great problem of how to exist in this world when we have lost faith in a transcendental God. We've lost faith in the old laws of morality and religion, but still we know that we are distinct from the rest of nature. We still bear that halo around ourselves, and that halo he redescribes as the condition of freedom. Many people, however, think that this is not an answer to the question of human nature, so much as another way of posing the problem. If we go back to the antecedents of Sartre, I suppose the principal one was Nietzsche, who had a vision of human nature as something which is always incomplete and unaccomplished. He exhorted us to become who you are. That is the only right way for a human being to live, not to be content with the identity and the order and the morality that we inherit from our surrounding social world, but to become what we are in ourselves, to move forward, to realize the potential that we are born with. And that means always to be going on, overcoming what we've achieved so far. Our nature is for Nietzsche the nature of a thing that overcomes its own nature. So the nature is never, as it were, a permanent acquisition. It's always a temporary hypostasis in the ongoing march towards being the individual that you will ultimately be. And of course, that was very intoxicating, that idea, to people at the end of the 19th century as an answer to the so-called death of God, which Nietzsche famously announced. Not that he was the first to announce it, but he rejoiced in announcing it in a way that others hadn't. And it is connected also with the person from whom Sartre learned his philosophy, namely Heidegger, who argued that we, self-conscious beings, whom he called Dasein, being in the world, we don't just have being, we have the question of being, the question of what it is that we are and how to confront our own being, and that there is a distinction, he believed, between living authentically and living in another way in subjection to the rule of others. And the authentic way of life is a way of life, as Sartre advocated, of being as it were, the sovereign of your own identity and being. So there was a radical refusal in both Nietzsche and Heidegger to take account of the rest of human nature, all the bits other than this halo of freedom, all that is outside the eye, all that is vested in biological destiny. I think we're living now through the kind of long-term effects of those ideas. Those ideas were very intoxicating when uttered by intellectuals as part of their ongoing dialogue, given in proof of their superiority to the rest of us. But when they filtered down to ordinary life, these ideas can become somewhat disconcerting and even disorienting. And so we live with a kind of destructive legacy which encourages us to see as chosen that which cannot be chosen, but only at best imitated. We're in the business of, as you know, of trying to rewrite human nature, so all those things which seem most fundamentally a part of what we inherit and what we cannot change become instead objects of social choice. And this we've seen very much in the sex, gender, transgender issue, as though I can be the sex or gender that I choose to be. Even using those the new word gender to describe my being as a man and Ferdia's being as a woman is an extraordinary innovation. The word gender comes to us from the study of grammar. You know, there are some nouns in the masculine gender, others in the feminine gender. We use those terms masculine and feminine for a variety of reasons, but it has nothing to do with the sex of things. And there are genderless languages, of course, like Turkish and Hungarian, which do not make this distinction of grammar, but it doesn't mean that they treat men and women in any different way from the way that we do. Well, if anything, of course, the Turks, looking back historically, have not been particularly notable for their attitude towards women as potentially emancipated beings. But it's not because they have a genderless language that is so. But nevertheless, we've adopted that word gender in order to try and rewrite our sexual identity as man or as woman in such a way that it seems like something you can choose. I can choose to be feminine, and many of my male friends are extremely feminine, but that's not what we mean by gender now. We mean actually the whole posture towards the world and identity, sexual identity, which is expressed in the relations between the sexes. Can that be the object of choice? Well, once people start thinking that it can, they try to remake human nature so as to make it an object of choice, and to toy with the idea that I am deep down perhaps a woman, and it's only an accident that deep nature, which is my true nature, has not come to the surface and realized itself in a female body. And perhaps then it becomes the obligation of the health service to help me to achieve that female body, to realize my deep nature as a woman, and the deep fact about my gender, because that is something that I ought to be free to choose, because it's so fundamentally a part of my self-conception. Now, I'm not saying that there's any easy answer to the question of what do you do when people do have that thought, but you can see that it has a history, that thought. It comes out of the view that really our essence lies in those things that we can choose. And therefore, if we think of something as part of our essence, like our sex, that's what I am fundamentally a man, then we ought to bring that thing into the arena of choice so that it really is an authentic expression of what I am for myself, of that first person singular, the I in which my freedom resides. And the consequence of this is, of course, the extreme confusion that people now have when they confront this issue. On the other hand, of course, all that emphasis on freedom as the essence of the human condition has to confront a completely rival conception of what we are, the conception that comes from biology. We do identify ourselves also as members of a species, the species of Homo sapiens sapiens. And the human being is the name, for a scientist at least, of a natural kind. Natural kinds are very special kinds of kinds. They're the kinds that exist in nature which have an identity of their own, which is not for us to determine, but which is determined by the laws governing the existence and development of that kind of thing. So many scientists would say that humankind is a biological species whose behavior exhibits the kind of cognitive organization which is made possible by having the sort of brain that we have, a digital processing brain, which acts as our computers do to process information coming in from outside and generate the appropriate responses to that information. And we have a whole new battery of sciences, cognitive science, neuroscience and so on, devoted to understanding this process, how it is that organisms like us can proceed through the world reacting to things not in a stimulus-response way, as mollusks do, for instance, but by understanding what's going on around them and shaping their response accordingly. And this involves taking life seriously. We are living beings, so we share with other species all the processes that make life possible and express life from moment to moment. It means taking death seriously as well. Death has, of course, always been a problem for the human species, but it's only a problem because we think of our condition in the way that Sartre was thinking about it, in terms of the first person singular, that I, at the center of our view of things. When I try to imagine death as my death from the point of view of the I, what is it like for me to be dead? That's a meaningless question because, of course, there is no I remaining, well, at least depending on what you believe, of course, but for the scientist, the I is extinguished. Death is unimaginable from the first person point of view. I can't imagine this I as it would be in the moment after dying. But precisely because we can never relinquish that first person view of things, it's so deeply implanted in our imagination, there comes in the place of the idea of death, the idea of an afterlife, of what it is that this I then experiences. But if you're taking life seriously, looking upon the human condition not from the point of view, the subjective first-person point of view, but from outside, then I am this organism. And this organism, of course, dies like any other organism. There's no problem in understanding that, any more than there's a problem in understanding the death of a dog or a horse. So death, on this view, ceases to be an intellectual problem, and most scientists who go along with that way of looking at things will try and argue that it's not a moral problem either. It's no kind of a problem, that it's only the illusion generated by self-consciousness that makes death into such a difficulty for us. We just have to learn now to retreat, to prescind from that first-person viewpoint and look on ourselves as we look on other animals from that impartial scientific perspective. And the real essence of a natural kind, like the tiger or calcium carbonate, whatever concept you want to take as your paradigm, the real essence is revealed by the science of that kind. And the science of our kind is the science of a particular molecule, the DNA, which is passed on from one person to his progeny. In which case, where am I? Where am I in all that? And this is one of the things that generates a whole battery of philosophical questions. You can, which began perhaps with John Locke, questions about personal identity. I can imagine this body continuing, but the I that remembers my experience and which forms intentions for the future, which contains a body of knowledge of its own actions and conditions, I can imagine that I being transported into another body. Perhaps my brain is, the information content of my brain is downloaded onto some great computer and uploaded into another brain in another body, in which case, which of those bodies is me? Now, there are lots of, those of you in this room who are studying philosophy will have come across lots of these problem cases where we seem to be pulled in two incompatible directions in saying that this other body is me or that it's not me. We tend to think of identity of a person in terms of the continuity of his body, but he himself doesn't think of it in that way. He thinks of it in terms of the continuity of this I, this light inside, which is shining in an enduring way, the consciousness of self on all the experiences that come before it. So there are a lot of thought experiments here which have compelled philosophers to think that there is a real problem about personal identity and whether being the same person, being Roger Scruton, is determined by being embodied in this particular organism or not. If it's not determined by that, if this particular organism could be one day Roger Scruton, another day someone completely different, whose brain has been, as it were, uploaded into mine, then that seems to suggest that human beings are not, after all, identical with a particular animal, and that the kind to which we belong is not a natural kind. It's not the species Homo sapiens that we're talking about, but something else. That kind of thing that is manifest in our mental processes and in our use of the word I. Self-consciousness then becomes a crucial fact, a distinguishing feature of the human condition, and one that doesn't yield to scientific analysis in the way that many biologists would hope. And this, at a certain stage in the development of modern psychology, this led to interesting problems and interesting illusions. People began to look for a science of the human being by reading self-consciousness back into our initial condition, as though the science of human behavior were, after all, a science of the self. This is something which you find in the writings of Sigmund Freud, who I think is probably less fashionable today than he was when he first burst on the world of intellectual argument, but still has a huge following, because he didn't merely give a new picture of the human being, he associated that picture with a kind of therapy, offering to people the hope of curing them of what he persuaded them to regard as medical conditions. He came from a particular culture where the title doctor actually conferred authority on people, not like the culture of modern university, where it reveals the second-rateness of who you are. So Freud thought that the infant already is a self. He doesn't speak yet, but he already has all those states of mind that people learn to acquire, of course, in their adolescence. He already, for example, has sexual desire, not in the full sense of desire for this person, this mother in front of him. He desires her as another self. He wants to connect to her in just the way that he will later want to connect to the young woman who recalls her loving features and calls up from him a kind of replica of that initial passion. But also the father is there, forbidding this desire, and therefore telling him ensuring that it is not expressed. And the proof of this, of course, is the existence of this incest taboo, which makes it such a huge crime actually to commit incest, the crime committed by Oedipus, which is for Freud a proof of the strength of the passion between a boy and his mother, and so on. The superego then grows, the internalization of the father's interdiction. And the result of this way of looking at things, Freud's, is that he has projected back into the life of the infant all the things that make for a full personal life in the grown-up man or woman, as though the infant has actually come into the world already fully self-conscious, a full moral agent with all the passions that moral agents have, and it simply has to be beaten into submission by the father figure in order to stop him expressing them. In other words, the I begins at birth. That was an attempt to explain psychological development by assuming that it's a development of the self. It's an overt rejection of the biological picture. In contrast to that, obviously the evolutionary psychologist would say this is total nonsense. We are not self-conscious at birth. The passions that Freud is attributing to us only come later, when we do have that sense of ourselves as related by I, as an I to a thou. And that at birth we are, of course, members of the human species. And the reason why there's an evolutionary, why there is an incest taboo, is not that we really want to do it. You really want to make love to your mother or whatever. It's because you really don't want to do it. Human beings who do it have all died out. That's the the evolutionary explanation is straightforward and obviously true as soon as you think about it. But it depends upon recognizing that a huge bequest of our nature comes from our biological formation and is completely independent of our development as self-conscious rational beings. So that's an example of a mistake that can be made by trying to understand what is in fact part of our biology in terms of our personal life as self-conscious beings. And we can make the other mistake of trying to understand our personal life as self-conscious beings in terms of mere biology, as many evolutionary psychologists do today. But what I think, what I'm trying to put across and have tried to express in that little book of mine is that these two accounts of our nature as biological organisms and as self-conscious agents are both absolutely necessary to us, both founded in the facts, but are in some way incommensurable. You can't swap from one to the other, as Freud hopes to do, and come up with a coherent explanation. All that went wrong with Freudian psychology came about because he tried to transfer into the biological realm concepts that belong in the personal realm. And the reverse problem has occurred with the account of human nature that you get given by people like Richard Dawkins. So what then is the correct account of human nature according to philosophy? I agree with Nietzsche that we do become what we are, but what we become is not only human animals, that is taken for granted, but we also become persons. We are persons in potential from the very beginning, but we may not actualize that potential. There are human beings in this world, very unfortunate human beings, who are not able to actualize their potential as persons. That's to say, they're not able to engage in those relations with others which give foundation to the concept of I. And I think we must therefore describe what we are in terms of what we become, that realized nature, when the dialogue that relates us to others has the maximum chance of fulfillment. We are realized through our relation with others. Many philosophers have written about this in one way or another. I particularly appreciate Martin Buber, who was a Jewish philosopher, a German Jewish philosopher of the early part of the 20th century, who emphasized what he called the I-thou, the ich-du relation, which depends upon each person identifying himself as an I in relation to another I, an ich in relation to another ich. This relation between two people, when they refer to each other, one as I and the other as you, this relation has the kind of transparency that relations between animals does not have. When people relate to each other in this way, there is a kind of calling to account. A person doesn't have to be a friend, it could be an enemy or just a business colleague, but if you are in this kind of relation to him, you can ask him the question, why? Why did you say that? Why did you do that? Why did you put arsenic in my tea? Whatever it might be. And you're calling upon the other person to justify himself in your presence, to show that what he did or said or thought or felt is what you might have said or thought or felt, and to that extent he is not abusing the relation but playing his own equal part in it. So there's a kind of demand for equality that's involved in this, a demand that we account to each other, and we do this by taking a view from outside, what Adam Smith called the view of the impartial spectator. In all our real relations with each other, we're not just relating directly as we might relate to an animal, we're also standing back and asking ourselves whether we're doing things correctly, whether we're abusing or not the other person. And this was all summarized by Kant in his philosophy of the categorical imperative, which says essentially that all rational or self-conscious beings are motivated by by reason, to adjust their actions so as to obey the categorical imperative, which tells us to act only on that maxim or principle that we can will as a law for all rational beings. In other words, always to act in such a way as you would want to see others acting towards you. And this is, I think, now something which many people, for a variety of reasons, would see as fundamental to the human condition. However, it creates an immovable puzzle. I am, on this view, essentially this thing that I identify in the first person. I don't have to consult my physical appearance or state of my body in order to know what I am thinking and feeling and doing and intending. So all the relevant facts about myself, which are relevant to my relations with you, are revealed to me, given to me in consciousness, not something I have to find out, not something that depends in any way, from my point of view, on knowing anything about my body. So I address you from that horizon where I am, the horizon of I, which is not part of the empirical world. It's not unlike my body, it's not there in the world. It's the horizon where I stand, so to speak, is a place where you could never stand. You could never see the world from the point of view of this first-person perspective unless you were me. And you can't be me without ceasing to be you. So this is part of what I would call the enchantment of the human condition, that all of us face each other from this inaccessible horizon where we each stand, rejoicing in our freedom, as Sartre rightly said, but in some deep way inaccessible to the other. We have to engage from that horizon with each other, and that from that position we envisage another world as well, a world in which perhaps the body falls away, this obstacle to our mingling with each other falls away. And Kant described that other world as the kingdom of ends, in which all is as it ought to be, and we are emancipated from the constraints of our bodily existence. And I would want to finish just by reading you a little passage from Kant's great work, which is the Critique of Practical Reason, in which he refers famously to the idea of duty, which is his way of summarizing that all that I've been saying about the I to thou relationship in which we are bound to each other. He says that it can be nothing less than a power which elevates man above himself, a power which connects him with an order of things that only the understanding can conceive, with a world which at the same time commands the whole sensible world, and with it the empirically determinable existence of man in time, as well as the sum total of all ends. This power is nothing but personality, that is, freedom and independence on the mechanism of nature, yet regarded also as a faculty of a being which is subject to special laws, namely pure practical laws given by its own reason, so that the person as belonging to the sensible world is subject to his own personality as belonging to the intelligible world. Now, that's phrased in terms of Kant's technical language, but what he's essentially saying is that we do indeed exist in two ways. As members of a species, the species Homo sapiens, embodied as I am embodied and as you are all embodied in that particular kind of organism as part of the empirical world and as such an animal, but we also exist in another way as part of this nexus of relationships between things that can identify themselves in the first person as I. These things which, in doing so, exercise their freedom and relate to each other through a sense of accountability to the moral law. As such, we are not just human animals, we are persons. And the great question for all philosophers today is, what is the relation between those two ideas? What is it that makes a person into a person as opposed to a human being? Are there persons who are not human beings? Religious people believe, of course, that there are gods, angels, and so on, who are not human beings, but nevertheless who relate to us as persons do. As I say, they account for each other. And Jews who believe in the covenantal relation between man and God think that God has to account to man just as much as man accounts to God. And this is the primary personal relation, nothing to do with being human. Although again, Christians will say, well, it only makes sense because God did take on human flesh and that the human form has been sanctified by the incarnation. So there are lots of really interesting theological ideas which, as it were, unfold around this mystery, the mystery of how it is that we can have two complete but incommensurable natures. And I'll leave you with that mystery because you're going to have to live the rest of your life with it anyway.